Welcome to Aspire, an I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent.
Today, I am your host, Katie Shipp, the Executive Director of the nonprofit I Have the Right To, and I am joined by two remarkable individuals and co-hosts for this podcast, Susan and Alex Prout, co-founders of I Have the Right To. After the sexual assault of their daughter, Chessy Prout, author of I Have the Right To, a high school survivor's story of sexual assault, justice, and hope, they have dedicated their time and resources to educating young people in supporting survivors and their families. Susan is dedicated to working with survivors and their families, as well as schools and communities, to create safe spaces and support systems for those affected by sexual assault. She passionately advocates for transformed justice system, one that upholds ethical standards, rejects victim blaming, and recognizes the importance of understanding trauma's effects on the brain. Her mission ensures that the rights of sexual assault victims are upheld alongside those of other crime victims. Joining her is Alex Prout, a national advocate against gender-based violence and a victims' rights advocate. Alex focuses on educating students about their rights to safety and respect, inspiring them through programming centered on aspirational masculinity. This concept encourages young men to reach their full potential as individuals rather than conforming to socially constructed norms of masculinity. In today's episode, we'll delve into their journeys, the work of I Have the Right To, and their vision for a future free from sexual violence. Let's get started. Good afternoon, Alex and Susan. We're so happy to have you.
Hey, Katie.
Hi, Katie. So good to be with you.
As some of our listeners may know, you are the parents of Chessy Prout. Chessy is a survivor. She was sexually assaulted when she was a freshman student at St. Paul's boarding school. Can you tell us a little bit about Chessy's experience and how your family reacted to that experience in your journey since then?
Hi, thank you, Katie. It's so good to be with you here today and our listeners. Yes, so our experience with our second daughter was the experience no parent wants to have, which is I got a call late at night, right after we had just spent the weekend with her for her sister's high school graduation. We'd all been together with our extended family, and it was a really significant weekend for us, but I had left the campus and I was back at home at my childhood home with my mother, who was not doing well, and my youngest daughter. And I got a call with Chessy crying on the phone saying, Mom, something terrible has happened. And that's when your heart drops. And so indeed, she had been sexually assaulted that weekend while we were there, and she had kept it to herself. Later, she said she didn't want to upset all the plans for the weekend. And it had escalated, and there was a lot of gossip about it around the campus. And so she called just incredibly upset. And neither Chessy nor myself had the words to accurately describe it. She said, a boy had sex with me and I did not want it. And I couldn't call it what it was, which of course is rape, or the term that New Hampshire uses, which is called sexual assault. So the number one thing that mattered to me in that moment was my child going to be safe? My husband wasn't with me. He was already on a business trip, and my 7-year-old was sleeping in the bed next to me. And again, my mother was ailing, and I was trying to take care of her in the other room. And I needed to make sure that Chessy was looked after, and she assured me she was. And all I could do in that moment, I was more than 5 hours away from her, was to assure her that we would get through this together. She would have my complete support, and to please not to worry, and that I would see her in the morning. I would get up to school. So of course, I did not sleep that whole night. And she said an advisor on campus had heard her crying and had asked her to speak with her. And she'd said the words to her, and this person and I have never spoken about this, but she said, how you choose to handle this, Chessy, will inform the rest of your life. And those aren't words that I've ever used with my kids before, but they stuck in my head all night. And so 7 a.m. came around. I called her counselor at school and I left her a message. Of course, she wasn't in her office yet. I said, I'm coming up. And I repeated Chessy's words that she used. And when the counselor and I spoke on the phone, as I was driving up, she called it rape. And I, was really didn't know what to say, didn't know what to make of it. And she then later met with Chessy and then started the process of what they needed to do, which was to report to the doctor at the health center on campus, who then directed the counselor, whose name is Buzz, and who we will always think, be so appreciative of Buzz and her support of Chessy, and said that she had to go get a rape kit done at the local hospital with a sane nurse. And so by the time I got up to school some hours later, Chessy was ready to go, and I took her, and Buzz came with us to the hospital. And that's when the wheels were set in motion. And I realized that so many of the things that happened for us were very fortuitous, and we were very, very lucky that they happened the way they did. Buzz was very supportive. The school doctor knew that it had to be reported to the authorities. A very compassionate female detective met us at the emergency room, and the sane nurse was also very kind. And then I watched like everything kind of unfold. And the detective said to Chessy, would you like to make a statement? And we were scheduled to leave the state to go home, which was a flight away. And, Chessy just is a rule follower, as is our family. And she said, yes, I'll make a statement tomorrow. But I watched Chessy's face as the detective said, he could get in trouble for what he did to you, Chessy. And at that moment, I just saw the awareness dawn on her that what had happened to her wasn't her fault, and that she was starting to understand the seriousness with which people were taking what happened to her.
And we're so grateful that Chessy did speak up, because what we've learned through our work is that so many survivors remain silent with what happened to them because they don't feel like they will be listened to or believed. And, we're also very fortunate. Chessy's always had, since the time she was born, a very strong and unique sense of right and wrong. And, you know, after the assault and over the next 36 hours, Chessy heard from other friends on campus that this young man had done the same thing to her. And I think that also steeled in her commitment to move forward, because what she said to me was, if I don't speak up, this gentleman, this man, not gentleman, will do it to someone else. And that was sort of a natural, I think, response from everyone in our family. Yes, of course, we need to speak up, and yes, of course, we need this young man to be held accountable for what he did.
That's right. Absolutely.
So, just as a follow up question, would you be able to share a little bit about your family's history with the school and what your expectations were when Chessy spoke up and how the community reacted, and maybe how that reaction was a little bit different than what you expected based on your relationship with the school?
Sure. St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire is where Chessy was sexually assaulted. And this was a school that I went to when I was in high school. And I considered myself blessed to be able to go to St. Paul's School. It was a beautiful 2,000-acre school in the countryside of New Hampshire. And I grew up in New York City, where, as an athlete, my sports were very limited in terms of the facilities available to someone living in the middle of Manhattan. And I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to St. Paul's, and I went, and in many ways it shaped and formed my life. I studied Japanese at St. Paul's. I wound up building a career in finance, working in Japan, and I felt a lot of fondness. It was a little bit of a foreign environment for me in terms of the hierarchy and the structures there, but I did not notice them. I enjoyed my time there. And so much so that when we were overseas working for our job, our family was living in Asia. And I suggested to Suze that I would love to send my kids to St. Paul's. We were worried about them finishing out their high school career and whether we would need to move them in the middle of high school. And the option of boarding school, to me, based on my experience, seemed like a wonderful one as a gentle transition back to the US. The girls were raised in Tokyo, and I thought it would be a gentle, safe way to transition back to the US before they went to university. And little did I know that not only was I throwing them into the fire pan, I was throwing them into the fire, because what we subsequently learned is that St. Paul's has had a history of sexual abuse and cover-ups for the last 70 years. And we've had so many survivors come forward after Chessy spoke up publicly. And we've learned not only of the bad things that happened on campus, because I think we all understand bad things can happen, but the institutional betrayal conducted by the school in terms of actively looking to silence and squash survivors' voices. And this was something that shocked me and I did not expect. But that's because I lived within my own privileged bubble of being a man and wasn't able to visualize what this environment of St. Paul's would be like for my two daughters. And that was my limitation.
But that's not my background. And as the daughter of two public school teachers and as a mother of these two extraordinary young women that we raised in an international school called the International School of the Sacred Heart in Tokyo, Japan, I watched them flourish and be leaders in their schools, in academics and athletics. And they went to school with kids from over 50 different countries, from, you know, countries that they certainly had never visited before, but got to learn about in this amazing school environment. And so the fact that I would have entrusted my daughters to this school that was so well thought of in the upper echelons of American society, that has educated many of our country's leaders, and then to see that they weren't respected as students, as human beings, as people on a campus that had so much pride in its legacy there of the people that had gone there, I was aghast, Katie. And I couldn't believe that we were looking at the year we were looking at, 2014, and this is what was happening to my children. And it stirred a fire in me to understand why this had happened. And the first thing I did was ask the head of the school, who had also been a classmate of Alex's when he was there, and that we were friendly with. Our children were friendly, and I knew his spouse. And I said, why did this young man do this? What is his problem? What was wrong with him that he did what he did, which was called a game called the Senior Salute on campus, and that it had transpired for over 6 months, and that there were multiple attempts to connect with her when he took her to take pictures from a rooftop of a building that he had stolen keys to. And then which he took her to a locked mechanical room where he raped her. Now, I just want to clarify for listeners, New Hampshire does not use the term rape. They use the term sexual assault, and every state is a little different. So when you hear these terms used interchangeably, it's, I know, confusing to a lot of people and students, but you need to know how your state or district uses this terminology. So in all the court proceedings, it was called sexual assault. And that is indeed, it did mean rape.
And going back to one point of your question, Katie, how did the school and the school community respond? So the response of the community was horrendous and not what we expected at all. It was one where the leadership of the school chose not to acknowledge or address it in any real fashion. There was no conversation or learning moment with the students. This was a ritualized game of rape. that these young men were committing, because it was seniors looking to slay or score as many freshman girls before they graduated in the spring. So that response from the adults absolutely informed the attitude of the young people on campus, who shunned and isolated and shamed and blamed Chessy upon her return to campus in the fall. We needed to deal with so many bullying incidents where she was harassed and bullied, and eventually she wound up leaving the school. And I was shocked because I spent a lot of time on campus after each incident, speaking to the adults on campus, making my presence known to the students. And my conclusion to the headmaster, Mike Hirschfeld, was, Mike, the inmates are running the asylum. Someone was terribly hurt on this campus. A crime was committed. Another student is facing the prospect of prison, and nothing is being learned from this. And much to the opposite, bad behaviors are continuing. And the lesson they're learning from this is these things can continue without any accountability or responsibility. Now, if I had known then that they were hiding 70 years of abuse, I might have understood the reason for this malfeasance, but I wasn't aware then. We needed to go through a public criminal trial, a lot more hurt and pain before dozens of survivors came up to us and told us their Me Too stories.
So, what we learned in that experience, Katie, was that a community would rather believe a victim survivor did something wrong to bring this upon herself than that one of their own that they celebrated, that we all stood and applauded for at graduation as getting the highest award of the school, the rector's award for selfless devotion to school. He was on his way going to Harvard. He had said that he wanted to ultimately go to divinity school. And people would rather believe they weren't fooled by this young person, and that our daughter had done something wrong. And so that was really what we found to be so upsetting. And it was almost like watching a pendulum swing, and people were waiting to see which side the pendulum was going to land on, how the crowds were going to go. Were they going to support the victim, or were they going to support this young man that had had so many accolades heaped upon him by the school?
And,
And
and
it turned out that it landed with him. And the school community fundraised over $100,000 for his defense. And it was done by parents of Chessy's friends. And that was something that I think was of secondary trauma for not only Chessy, but actually our whole family, for her older sister and for us. And so that's a whole other issue, the secondary traumatization a community can inflict on someone who has suffered sexual assault.
well, and Suze, I want to go back to what you said the teacher said to Chessy. How you choose to handle this will inform the rest of your life. And I almost chuckle at that statement now, because I think of that comment in the context of St. Paul's and their behavior upon learning of this sexual assault and their behavior afterwards. How St. Paul's chose to handle this will inform their legacy. And the schools, Katie, has subsequently been put under Department of Justice supervision for 5 years. The Attorney General of New Hampshire found enough evidence to bring criminal charges against St. Paul's School, obstruction of justice and endangerment of children. And, the school continued to choose the same method that the young man and the other players of this conquest game played. Their tagline was "Deny until you die." And now we understand where they learned that phrase from the school leadership, which chose to deny that any problems existed at the campus despite their behaviors of the past.
Every
Right.
time I
And
hear Chessie's story, I'm always just overcome with just truly awe for how much courage she had as such a young person. Chessie was a freshman in high school. She was 15 years old, I believe, when this happened. And she came forward and she spoke up and she shared what happened to her. And instead of being met with community support, she was shunned and attempted to be silenced. And instead of being quiet, Chessy decided to stand up and speak out for what happened. And like you said, go through the justice system. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think encouraged Chessy to do that? How your family supported each other through that journey? And just what that was like as a family, because I have to believe that that was incredibly difficult.
Well, I have to think that the fact that we were used to relying on one another as being expats living overseas, so far from our own support systems, had something to do with it, Katie. We lived overseas for more than 11 years together in Japan, and we were a very tight unit. And the sisters were very close. Of course, they tried to cast so many aspersions on each of us. They tried to make my husband out, who you hear is very calm and collected, as a crazy, and there's some other ethnic slurs in there, father who was out for revenge. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Or that the sisters were competing with each other. But truly, Lucy said the most important words when Chessy first disclosed to her on the weekend of her graduation. And she told her what had happened. And Lucy said, "It's not your fault." And those are the words every survivor needs to hear when they first disclose. And as an attorney, Katie, for so many survivors, the first reaction from the person that a survivor tells is so important. And, she had a little sister who was 7 years old, who we could only convey that a boy hurt her. And what did she do? She enveloped her in love and hugs and kisses, whenever Chessy needed it, and helped Chessy through, many panic attacks. She just gave her what she could offer. So I think, your family, to us, our family is the most important reason for being, and we're very close. Not perfect, but we try our best to validate one another and to support one another. So that, I think, stemmed again from having raised the children the way we did in Japan as expats. And I think Chessie's voice really is something that is inherently part of her. She has had a voice since she was a little girl. And we just, always respected that about her. And in fact, Chessy also has had depression. And she's had that from a young age too. And that was something that was tried to be utilized against her. And she said, "Bring it on. You can tell people I have depression and that I'm being treated for it." But, they tried to use it as, well, she's crazy. So, there's that. So you can't really believe what she's saying. No, it's an and statement. Chessy has a voice, and she's had mental health challenges like so many young people, and grown-ups too, right? It's something that, we're tearing away the stigma about. But thankfully, she didn't bury what happened in feelings of shame. She had them, but somehow her voice and her belief in the importance of her voice came through all of those feelings. It took her 2 years to understand that she froze during her sexual assault. And that's from the biology of the brain workshop she learned at the Georgetown Day School Summit on Sexual Assault and Consent by our dear friend Bobby Asher. And when she heard that, it was news to her. She didn't know that that's what can happen to you when trauma affects your body. So this is all the information we want to get out in the world and share with young people and their communities, so that they can also get through trauma with love and support and not be secondarily victimized by their communities.
As we know, there's a lot of survivors who decide not to come forward once they have been met with the reaction that Chessy was met with, right? With the disbelief, with the shame, with the accusations. But Chessy did decide to go forward and she pressed charges and she went through the criminal trial. And I know that that was a very challenging time period for your family. Originally, Chessy had filed as a Jane Doe to protect her identity, as many minors, if not all minors, do in these cases, because it's a very private matter that they don't want shared with the world. Can you talk a little bit about Chessy's journey from when she filed the case until when she went public and what led her to go public and what that was like for your family?
I'd love to share the first part, and if you want to share the second part, Alex, but absolutely. So we told no one about what had happened. There were maybe a couple of people in her world on campus. There was a mother and a friend of hers on campus. And then my older daughter had a roommate and her mother on campus. And beyond that, there were, nobody we told about what had happened to Chessy. Wanted to protect her privacy. And so we went about our daily lives after that. And yet the St. Paul's community, it kind of went through the community like rumors do. And so
Well,
there
they all
were,
knew
right,
who she
everybody
was.
knew who she was. So there was no hiding that in a community of 600 students and faculty, with everybody being there at resident. Although the head of the school, who, when I asked him what was wrong with this young man, said to me, and something that still offends me deeply as a mother, he said, "It doesn't matter." Well, of course it mattered, because he hurt my kid and he hurt other young people too. But he said to us, these kids are so busy, everyone's going to forget about this by September. So it happened in May when the kids were graduating and finishing up with exams and leaving school. And he said, they won't even think about this in September. Well, guess what? It also became one of the top news stories in the United States. So how are the kids going to forget about it, much less know what to think about it, if school leadership isn't guiding the students? So they get F's on that in that regard of how they handled all of this information. But so, Chessy did her best. She tried. She said, I want to go back to St. Paul's school. And she did. And we were living overseas. We quickly pulled up stakes, and my youngest daughter and I moved home. My husband still was working out, details about his work, which is a whole other story of a debacle of how he wasn't supported by the company he'd worked for over 15 years. But went, and she participated in all the activities, but her teammates on the volleyball team let her down. They wouldn't wait for her for dinner. They would say, yeah, we'll be there. And then they would just leave without her. So she wouldn't have anyone to eat with. Or she would face the hockey team standing and staring at her when she went to pick up packages at the mail building. One of the deans of students had a daughter in school with her and said, I'll take you for ice cream and we'll do special things like that. And then we later find out that that dean of students had been reported to about his other aggressions and sexual assaults against other students. So what good does it mean taking my kid to ice cream if you're not doing the hard work of dealing with the culture at school? So she tried her best until later on that year, there was an announcement made in chapel by students about a powder puff football game, which, what's a powder puff football game doing on the campus of this institution that values academics so highly? But he said the announcement, which had to be vetted by the faculty, he said, you're all invited to attend unless you're underage, because underage of consent, because of course we can't touch you then. And it was a direct joke about this case looming in the media. He had been charged a month after Chessy reported, and there were all kinds of headlines about him possibly taking a plea deal. And Chessy didn't want that. She didn't want him to take a plea deal. She wanted him to face the consequences in court. But everyone was trying to prepare her that it would be a plea. So when that happened in chapel, Chessy said, that's it. I can't stay in this community any longer. And my brother, who lived nearby, picked her up, and it was heartbreaking. She left, and some of the girls who hugged her in this very poignant moment later turned against her when she left the school, and in really difficult ways that I don't know how Chessy's healed from those betrayals. But Chessy then came back to school in Naples, Florida, where we lived, and she was still Jane Doe and didn't tell anybody what had happened. And nobody knew, did she get kicked out or what had
Or
happened? And it
she was
was
not supposed to talk about the case. She'd
right.
been instructed, right?
And she took that to heart. She didn't talk about it with us. She didn't talk about it to her peers. So she kept the vow of being Jane Doe, like almost religiously that whole year until the trial in the spring. Oh,
So,
sorry, summer.
so what we learned was there are two sides to this topic of sexual violence. There's the victim side where there's so many things stacked up against the victim in terms of isolating, silencing, shaming them into non-existence. And then there's the side of the perpetrators and the institutional complicity and the enablers. And with our experience now in hindsight, we saw the full enablement of the perpetrator at St. Paul's, who, as Suze mentioned, was a star student. Everything was denied in terms of behaviors at the school. There's no problems with the culture. There's no history of abuse. This was an isolated incident. That's what we kept on hearing over and over from the leadership and the board of St. Paul's. And as Suze mentioned, the school community in 3 days raised $100,000 for this young man's defense attorney. So at every twist and turn, he saw support from the institution and the broader community, while my daughter was bullied and harassed. So that to me said there's something broken and wrong with this culture. And I engaged numerous times with board members who were former classmates of mine, with the head of school, with other teachers and faculty there, saying, I thought the mission of the school was to educate fine young people to be impact people, positive impact people in the world. And this was such a mismatch to me that I didn't really understand it until we pursued our lawsuit against St. Paul's. And this was something that was done because both Lucy and Chessy wrote a list of 40 things that they would like to see changed at the school as a result of everything they faced with the sexual violence and the bullying afterwards. And the school refused to even acknowledge there was a problem nor accept the list, which resulted in the legal action. And this the Jane Doe status was not something Chessy chose to do. This was a right afforded to her by the state of New Hampshire as the legal precedent for the status of an underage victim of sexual violence. And she was still a Jane Doe in terms of the lawsuit against St. Paul's. And the reason Chessy went public was because St. Paul's School lawyer, a gentleman named Michael Delaney, who's the former Attorney General of the state of New Hampshire, filed a motion on behalf of the school when we filed the lawsuit, wanting these changes to be put into place and improvements to be done. Mr. Delaney filed a motion challenging Chessy's anonymity if we chose to move forward with the lawsuit. And this was a tactic we saw constantly from the other side, which was threats and intimidation, hoping that we would be so shamed and so afraid of losing our quote unquote reputation, because I guess that's what is important to people on that side. And, Chessy had probably the most amazing reaction when she saw this legal motion. She came to Susan and I after reading it, and she said, well, it looks like St. Paul's is trying to intimidate me into silence. And I said, that's a very good interpretation of this motion because there is no legal basis for it. So it is just a threat. And Chessy said, you know what? I don't accept that threat. I'm going to out myself publicly. And within several weeks, she was, on the Today Show, and she brought with her this I Have the Right To campaign, challenging people to announce their rights to the world. I have the right to be heard. I have the right to use my voice. I have the right to wear what I want to a party and not be raped. There's so many rights that young people need to know that they have. And Chessy did this on the Today Show, and there are over 2 million hits on the I Have the Right To hashtag. And it sort of altered, the course of the family and led to our org.
What an incredible story and what bravery it took for Chessy to come forward and share her identity on national television. I'd love for you to share with our listeners why Chessy chose the I Have the Right to hashtag, because I think it's such a wonderful story and really is the start of a movement. And so where did I Have the Right to come from? Why did it start with that hashtag?
I'm so glad you asked, Katie, because that again goes back to our family as the core unit, I think, for Chessy's support. So she had left St. Paul's School. She was back in Naples, Florida, and she was taking AP US History, a push as it's known. And I love history. And because they'd lived overseas for so many years, I felt like they'd missed some key historical themes. And so I said, we're going to watch CNN's series on the decades. And it was a beautiful day. And we lived in Florida and we were kind of in and out of the pool all the time, but we were watching the segment on the 60s, my favorite decade. And as we watched it and we took a little snack break, my youngest daughter at the times, she was probably just about 8 years old then, said, as we watched all about the civil rights movement and marches, she said, well, given all that's happened, it sounds like, Chessy and Mom, it's time for a girls' Bill of Rights. And I couldn't believe this had just come out of her mouth. And I said, what are your rights? And as I want to do, I said, write them down. And I grabbed their markers and their crayons. And I said, give me a list of all your rights, Chessy, that you wish you had known before you were hurt by this young man. And let's talk about it. And so I made them sit down in their bathing suits. I have a picture of them outside doing this. And eventually Lucy added to them as well. And that became the genesis for the back of the book, the lists of rights. I have the right to find my voice and use it when I'm ready. I have the right to be called a survivor, not an alleged victim or an accuser. All these words were new for us, and they cut and they hurt. To say no and be heard. I have the right to not be shamed and bullied into silence. I have the right to name what happened to me, because being sexually assaulted is never excusable or complicated. There is no perfect victim. And these were such powerful phrases that eventually, when Jen Abelson came into our lives from the Boston Globe Spotlight team, and she said she wanted to expose these stories from boarding schools and then get to know more about Chessy. And then she ultimately said, Chessy, I think you have the complete makings for a book about your experience. That's how the title became the title of the book, I Have the Right to. And the full title is A High School Survivor's Story of Sexual Assault, Justice, and Hope. And this was all just before the women's movement and the Me Too movement. And I think they handed in their manuscript the summer Chessy graduated from high school. And we were literally moving furniture in truckloads. So they would be working in our home and the chairs would be gone and then the tables would be gone, but they kept writing. And finally, we moved up to Washington, D.C. to be closer to other advocacy groups up here. And they handed in the manuscript, and then Me Too exploded. And I remember mothers coming up to me saying quietly, I think Chessy had something to do with people speaking up. And I knew darn well she had, because so many older people would say to me, if your 15-year-old can do this, then I can speak my truth too. And so that's how the book came to be. And then the amazing cover of the book, it looks like she was it was a sign for marching in that amazing women's march that followed shortly after in 2018. And yeah, I mean, it feels like, again, it was the genesis of a civil rights reckoning. And that's what it is. And Chessy's civil rights were trampled on at St. Paul's, as were so many other survivors,
Both
that
male and female.
male and female. And that's wrong. And it was way overdue for this to be reckoned with, certainly in their community.
And what's remarkable about I absolutely cherish and love the name of our org, the name of Chessy's book, our youngest daughter's words,
Mhm.
that morning. But I love the evolution of what that means because when these words were first declared by our 8-year-old and followed up by Susan, as she is wont to do, it was all said in the spirit of indignation, right? About rights that my 3 daughters and my wife were screaming for, basic human rights that, they were so simple and basic. When I heard them, I was able to step out of my male privilege a bit and say, "Oh my gosh, these are just assumptions that I carry all the time. I've never thought I have the right to be heard as a man, and I have the right to be seen. I have the right to be acknowledged. I have the right to say no and be heard." These are such basic human rights that if we could just get people to stop and listen. But this is how all movements start, this indignation to say, time out, wait a second. This is not right. We're all human beings and we deserve dignity. We deserve respect. We deserve safety wherever we exist. And St. Paul's was not a safe environment. It was so unsafe that our daughters who wrote their 40 list of 40 things they would like to see changed, the last one on the list was slightly cheeky, possibly. They said, "We do not believe St. Paul's will acknowledge or do any of these previous changes on this list. So our last request is that they go back to being an all boys school. So no more girls will be harmed there." Now, the only thing wrong with that was that they weren't aware of all of the history of abuse against boys at the school. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed. But as we have all evolved, and it's been now 10 years since Chessy was assaulted, what I love about I Have the Right to now is that there's so much hope around the I have the right to statement. I have the right to bring change. I have the right to demand justice. I have the right to, and we found many people telling us the sort of complement to an I have the right to statement is by us older people or people in positions of authority or power to say, I have the obligation or we have the obligation to create safe environments where all of our community can flourish, right? So there's been such a beautiful arc and journey through this that, 10 years on now, we can say it was a difficult and challenging journey. And if we can get one message out to survivors out there, is things do seem dark, hopeless when this happens to you. And the data and stats say it's happened to over 25 million people in the US. And what we are trying to provide is a light at the end of the tunnel to let people know there is a community out there that will love and support you, will believe you, will stand with you. And these are such, again, basic important messages that we want to get out there.
As a mom, Katie, and I know you can relate to this, you have 2 little ones that are amazingly educated in this area and empowered. I know you share with us, and that's a whole other podcast, how we can talk to our young ones. But my
Definitely.
whole goal was to make sure Chessie survived this experience and could be the person she's always been meant to be. And so to that end, we formed our organization so Chessie could go ahead and live that life, but that we could also share with everybody and pay it forward. The all the fortuitousness of like the wonderful people that were on this journey with us, the amazing prosecutor, Catherine Ruffle. And we could do a whole subset talk on the court procedures too, and the detectives and the advocates for the coalition. But the reason we have our org is so that we can pay it forward with survivors individually.
I would love to jump in and talk about the org and where we've gone from there, but quickly just to wrap up the other portion of our discussion, can you share just what the ending of the criminal trial looked like, what the resolution was with the criminal trial? And then I'd love to start talking about I Have the Right to.
The criminal process, we completely understand with this experience why so many survivors are hesitant to speak up and go through it, because we have, in many ways, one of the better criminal justice systems supposedly in the world. But having lived through it, we've seen all of the flaws involved. As Suze mentioned, Chessy was repeatedly referred to as the alleged victim and the accuser. There is no other crime, Katie, where the victim is referred to in those words. If you have your car stolen, you're not referred to as the alleged victim or the accuser. These have absolute inferences that the other side uses against the victims. We went through a 2-week and very public criminal trial. St. Paul's school community again gave $100,000 to hire Whitey Bulger's defense attorney. Whitey Bulger, for those who don't know, is an Irish mafia kingpin from Boston. And his attorney, Jay Carney, became the perpetrator's attorney. And he used every dirty trick in the book to rail the process. He wasn't seeking justice. He was looking to confuse and possibly derail the trial. And to me, that was unfair. I viewed justice as a sacred process. And what I witnessed were tactics and behaviors that I did not associate with a justice process. Fortunately, there was a jury, we had a fair judge, but the defense used what they referred to as the Harry Potter defense. The perpetrator was cleaned up, got a haircut, put on fake glasses, and dressed in a tweed jacket and tie, and showed up to trial every day, and literally claimed on the stand that there was divine inspiration, God interceded and allowed him not to commit this crime. And, the jury was left with a decision whether to send this young man to prison for up to 60 years or, to take some mercy on them. And there was, I think, an element of splitting the baby here. The young man was convicted of 1 felony charge and 4 misdemeanors, and he wound up spending a year in jail. But this was after an exhaustive 2.5, 3-year appeal process. And then a lot of, PR and publicity seeking maneuvering by, his supporters at the school to, again, try to let him escape accountability and responsibility. So there was some measure of justice received during the criminal trial, but what we learned was the goal was not the truth. The goal was to deny, cover up, and confuse.
And as we know, so many survivors don't even get to this point that Chessy got to. So the fact that criminal charges were pursued and there was some element of guilt found is really not a common experience for survivors. And I know that this process and your experience inspire you to create the nonprofit I Have the Right to. And I want to hear a little bit about that. But I also want to hear about we learned a lot about the community that let you down, the community that wasn't there for you and your family in the way that you thought that they would be. However, because I've gotten to know the two of you, I know that you found a new community during this process. And I'd love to hear about the community that stood up for you and how that inspired founding the org I Have the Right to, and how the response to Chessy going forward and saying her name to the world and sharing that, she is Jane Doe in the St. Paul's case and that she has the right to use her voice, how that inspired you to start the nonprofit. If you could talk a little bit about that, I'd love to hear more about it.
Absolutely. For almost 2 years, we never spoke to another survivor or survivor's family. And that should not be that way. Anyone who ever goes through this needs supportive community around them. So when we finally did get to speak to advocates who'd been down this road and survivors, that changed everything for us. Chessy became more of the person she is and had people around her that knew and supported her and believed her without and having a question asked. They just understood the journey. And that is what every survivor really deserves. She had some amazing teachers at her new school that said, listen, you've been through trauma. If you need time out, take time out, and gave her safe spaces at her school. So I'll always be so grateful to her school community back in Naples, Florida, for how they supported her. So, and then there were some amazing journalists, including obviously Jen Abelson. Jen Abelson has the utmost journalistic standards. And when they wrote the book together, she didn't make Chessy repeat details that were traumatic. She used any kind of documentation she could from the court or from any kind of police reports. And she was able to really treat Chessy with the utmost respect while she wrote the memoir with Jen. So that was amazing.
And I also have to shift back to the criminal process for a bit because we had the most amazing team that worked with us that we felt so blessed with. You know, Detective Curtin and DeAngelis from the Concord Police Department, Catherine Ruffle from the Merrimack County Attorney's Office, and the whole support team at the MCAO that just so intentionally, so trauma informed, so victim centric, surrounded Chessy with a cocoon of support that I don't think without that we could have made it through the criminal process
Right.
intact.
And then we had some dear friends and family that were able to support us. So that meant everything.
Yep. And then we also gained our first exposure to the advocacy world during that trial, receiving great support from the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. There was, a victim advocate inside the attorney's office or team there that really supported us. And, we learned there are people doing God's work out there and helping survivors, but we saw such a big machine stacked against survivors from speaking up. So Susan and I remember this so intently. Susan and I looking at each other during the darkest moments of this experience, and we said, if we make it through this, we will dedicate every living breath, every ounce of energy that we have until our dying day to make sure no other survivor and their family goes through what Chessy and our family went through, because it was not fair, it was not justified, it was unwarranted, and there was so much that needs to change. So that's where we were left standing, after this whole experience.
Thank you, Alex and Susan, for sharing Chessy's journey and what it was like for you and your family to go through the criminal process. I'd love for our listeners to hear what life has been like for Chessy after the trial and how she's doing now.
Thank you, Katie, for asking. So Chessy's doing really well. I think the number one thing she wanted to do after this whole experience, which makes so much sense now, is the first thing she did when she finished her memoir was to get her beloved dog. His name is JJ. He's a beautiful mini golden doodle, and he's now not a puppy anymore, but she has grown with this little creature. She has proven to herself that she can love and take care of him. And it has been, you know, such a healing process for her. And that was one of the things that Buzz responded to us about. She said that, I think Chessy needs something to love and care for. And I highly recommend that to survivors who love animals. He's been such a gift to Chessy and our family. She is pursuing everything that she wanted to pursue. She took a gap year and traveled the world with her book and met survivors back in her home country of Japan, and then as far as Australia and back throughout the United States. And she's made so many amazing friendships in the survivor world. She's taken time to support other survivors, notable and and people that you don't hear about in the news since her experience. So she continues to pay it forward herself. She graduated from college. She is still very interested in film, and she made a short film when she graduated from university, from Barnard and Columbia University. And she has a 10-minute short called Aftermath, which is a fictionalization of one of the chapters in her book. It is beautiful, and it was made with this loving community that she has where she goes on vacation. And we are so grateful to this community for all the support they've shown Chessy and our family. And now she's living her life. She lives in a city. She works for a film company, and she has a very supportive boss and organization where she gets to do all the things she wanted to do in film.
Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.